The observer came to Earth in silence. He carried no weapon, no banner, only the duty to watch. He had been told that humanity's history was filled with endless wars. His role was to see the truth and then decide if these people were a threat to all. He believed it would be simple. He thought he would find nothing but chaos and ruin. When he stepped onto the soil, the air carried a weight of smoke and memory, as if the ground itself remembered battles. He walked through towns where buildings had been broken and rebuilt many times. On the walls he saw marks of bullets, but he also saw paint, bright colors drawn by children. He stopped at one corner where an old man sat carving wood into the shape of a bird. The man looked at him and said nothing, only nodded. The observer felt something stir inside him, something he could not name. He had come to judge, not to feel. Soon he was led to a group of soldiers. Their uniforms were worn, their faces marked with scars. John stood among them, tall and broad, his eyes sharp but tired. Beside him was Claire, smaller in frame but firm in will. John greeted the observer with a voice rough from years of shouting orders. Claire simply looked at him, her gaze steady. They did not speak of victories. They spoke of losses, of men who had fallen and friends who had not returned. The observer listened, trying to understand why they carried such pain, and still stood ready to fight again. As days passed, he followed John and Claire. They showed him the fields where battles had burned the land black. In one place, trees still leaned broken, their branches torn by fire. John told him that men had fought there not for gold or pride, but to keep families safe in the villages behind the hills. Claire spoke of carrying wounded soldiers across the field, her arms shaking but never letting go. The observer began to see something he had not expected. These people did not fight only to destroy. They fought to protect, even when the cost was heavy. He asked them why they did not give up. John answered that giving up meant leaving their children to face chains. Claire said that surrender was worse than death. The observer did not know how to answer. He had seen other worlds where men surrendered quickly when faced with fire. But here, he saw a different strength, one that frightened him more than weapons. One evening, they came to a quiet place by a river. Children played in the water while women washed clothes on the stones. Laughter carried in the air, even though ruins stood not far away. The observer stood still, watching the scene. War had scarred this land, yet life rose again. He could not understand how such joy could exist beside such grief. John noticed his silence and said that this was the reason they fought. It's not for power, but so children could laugh even when the world tried to take that from them. As night came, the observer lay awake under the stars. His mind was full of images he had seen. Thought of scars on soldiers, of burned fields, of broken buildings. He also thought of the old man carving a bird, of Claire carrying the wounded, of children laughing in the river. He realized his task was not simple. Humanity was not only war and not only peace. They were both bound together. He felt unease, for the judgment he had once believed clear now seemed impossible. He had only begun to see what humanity truly was, and already he feared the truth he would find. The observer was taken to the heart of the city where the human queen lived. The road leading to her hall was wide but worn by years of use. People moved about with baskets and tools, their faces carrying both hardship and determination. The observer watched them closely. He had seen rulers in other places, men who sat on thrones of gold, blind to the suffering around them. He wondered what this queen would be. When he entered the great hall, he found no throne of gold. The queen sat upon a carved chair of stone, her crown simple, her dress plain, yet her presence filled the room. She did not look at him as a ruler looks at a servant, but as a woman who carried the weight of many lives. When he was brought before her, she asked him why he had come. Her voice was calm, neither proud nor afraid. He told her the truth. He had been sent to judge humanity through their wars, to decide if their kind was a danger. The queen did not rise to anger. She did not defend with words of pride. Instead, she spoke of the cost of war. She told him of villages that once stood where now there was only ash. She told him of men who left their homes with swords and guns and never returned. She spoke of women who carried grief in silence while raising children alone. She did not try to hide the pain of her people. The observer listened, waiting for her to speak of glory, but she never did. She spoke of sorrow, yet her eyes showed strength, and the queen called for men to be brought in. They were not soldiers but builders, farmers, and teachers. One man held hands rough from shaping stone into homes. Another man carried tools for plowing fields. A teacher spoke of children who gathered in ruined buildings to learn their letters even when bombs had fallen nearby. The observer was shown not the strength of armies, but the strength of people who created instead of destroyed. This troubled him more than the scars of war, for he saw in them a force he could not measure with swords or fire. Later, the queen walked with him through the gardens behind the hall. Though parts of the ground still bore marks of old battles, new flowers grew. She told him that each flower had been planted by hands that had once held weapons. She said men who survived battle often came here to place seeds so that something good might rise where blood had once fallen. The observer bent down and touched the soil. It was warm, alive, and he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He had thought judgment would be clear, but now doubt grew. As they walked, the queen asked him what he had seen so far. He spoke of John and Claire, of their wounds, of their unyielding will. He told her of the laughter of children by the river, of the old man carving a bird. The queen listened with quiet attention. She told him that war was not their pride, but their burden. She said humanity had made choices that brought fire, but also choices that rebuilt after the fire passed. She did not ask him to forgive. She only asked him to see them as they truly were. When night came, the observer stood at the high balcony of the hall. The city lights below glowed, not with the fire of war, but with the simple warmth of homes. Men walked beside women, carrying baskets, guiding children. Laughter rose faintly through the air. The queen joined him and spoke softly. She said that judgment was not for her to resist or deny, it was for him to carry. But she warned him that if he judged only by war, he would never see the whole of her people. Then she left him alone to think. The observer looked down at the city, troubled. He had come believing humans were only destroyers. Yet now, he saw they carried two faces, one of ruin and one of creation. He did not know which truth was stronger. As the stars shone above, he felt the weight of his duty grow heavier. Humanity was not simple to judge. There was something greater and something far more dangerous. The sound of drums echoed in the distance, and the observer knew that war had returned. He followed John and Claire to the fields where men gathered with rifles, blades, and bare hands. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The ground shook with the march of thousands. The observer stood at the edge, uncertain, but he knew he must see it all. He had been sent to watch, and this was the heart of what he had come for. John's voice cut through the chaos as he ordered men into position. His tone was sharp, steady, and unyielding. Ow. The men around him moved not as machines, but as brothers standing side by side. Claire stood with the medics, her bag already heavy with bandages. Her face was pale, yet her eyes did not waver. She knew she would carry the weight of the wounded before the night ended. The first strike came with a roar. Fire tore through the lines, men fell, and the ground shook under the blast. The observer flinched, but John did not move. He charged forward with his men, shouting for them to hold their ground. Bullets cut the air, blades clashed, and cries of pain filled the sky. Yet the soldiers did not run. Each step forward was fought with blood, yet they kept moving. The observer had never seen such will. Their bodies broke, but their spirit did not. Claire rushed into the smoke to drag a fallen man back. Her arms strained, her clothes stained with blood. Yet she did not stop. She tore cloth with her teeth to bind wounds, pressed her hands against bleeding chests, and whispered words of strength to those fading away. She carried one man after another, her small frame seeming stronger than iron. The observer watched her, stunned. In her he saw a battle greater than any weapon, the refusal to surrender even when surrounded by death. The night stretched on, and the field became a storm of fire. John's men fought with a fury that seemed impossible. Even when their lines broke, they reformed. Even when men fell, others stepped forward to take their place. Every strike they endured was met with one of their own. Their enemies expected fear, but what they faced was rage and defiance. The observer felt fear rise in his chest. If such fury were ever turned beyond their land, who could resist it? When dawn came, the field was red with blood and black with smoke. Bodies lay scattered, the earth torn and broken. John stood with his rifle still in hand, his clothes ripped, his face marked with soot and sweat. He did not cheer. There was no victory in his eyes, only the heavy knowledge of what had been lost. Claire knelt beside the last of the wounded, her hands trembling, her face streaked with tears. But she did not stop working even as her strength faded. The observer walked among the survivors. He saw men with shattered limbs standing tall, refusing to fall until their brothers were safe. He saw Claire guiding children who had come searching for their fathers. He saw John giving orders not to rest, but to bury the fallen with honor. There was no joy, no celebration, only silence and grim resolve. The observer felt his judgment slipping further away from certainty. Humanity was a storm, both saviors and destroyers at once. As the sun rose higher, the observer stood still. His heart was heavy, his mind torn. He had come to see monsters, but instead he saw men who carried their pain like armor. He saw women who turned their grief into strength. He saw a people who refused to break no matter the cost. And in that moment, fear took root in him. He feared what humanity might become if ever the fire within them was carried beyond their own soil. He feared because he knew nothing could stop them. The battle had ended, but the land still carried its scars. The observer walked through the ruins with heavy steps. Buildings stood half-broken, their walls blackened by fire. Streets were lined with rubble, yet already men and women had come to clear the stone. Hammers struck, wood was lifted, and voices called out to each other with strength. The observer felt a strange unease as he watched. Most people would hide after such loss, but here they rose again with blistered hands and tired eyes. Children ran between the ruins, their laughter sharp against the silence of broken homes. One boy carried a stick like a sword, chasing his friends through the rubble. A girl picked flowers that had grown through cracks of stone, tucking them into her hair. The observer paused, confused. Death still lingered in the air, yet life pushed through it. It was not denial, it was defiance. Humanity refused to bow even to grief. He came to a square where men were building a frame for a new hall. One man's arm was wrapped in bandages, yet he held the hammer steady with his other hand. Beside him, another man lifted heavy beams while limping on one leg. They worked together without complaint, their rhythms steady, as if each strike of wood and iron was an answer to the war that had tried to crush them. The observer spoke to them and asked why they worked with such urgency. One man replied that to rebuild was the only way to honor the dead, said that graves alone were not enough. The living must rise, or the fallen had died for nothing. Near the edge of the city, Claire tended to the weak. She moved from one wounded man to another, cleaning their cuts, whispering words that steadied their breathing. Her hands were blistered, her clothes torn, yet she did not rest. The observer watched her sit with a boy no older than 10, his arm broken and his face pale. She held his hand and told him he was strong, that he would heal. The boy smiled through his pain, clutching her fingers as if they were his anchor. Ah! The observer saw in her a power that no weapon could match. Later, he found John standing on a hill where fresh graves had been dug. Rows of wooden markers stretched across the field. John stood in silence, his hands clasped, his head bowed. When the observer joined him, John spoke without turning. He said every grave was a reminder not of defeat, but of duty. Said that those who lived had to carry on to make the lives of the fallen mean something. His words carried no pride, only weight. The observer listened and felt the burden of it press into him. The observer continued to walk through the ruined streets. He saw women gathering food for those who had none. He saw boys carrying buckets of water to families who had lost their homes. He saw old men shaping stone into walls, their backs bent, but their spirits unbroken. Each act was small, yet together they formed something greater than armies. They showed him that humanity was not only destruction, they were builders even in the ashes of war. As night came, fires burned in the streets, not as weapons, but as lights to guide the workers. Songs rose from tired voices, rough and uneven, but filled with strength. The observer sat alone, his heart unsettled. He had thought judgment would come through battles, through weapons and blood. Yet here in the broken streets, he saw the true force of humanity. They turned grief into courage, wounds into resolve, loss into reason to move forward. He realized then that humanity could never be measured by war alone. Their power was not just in how they fought, but in how they rose again after the fight. And that power frightened him more than any battlefield he had seen. The observer returned to the Queen's Hall with his heart heavy, He had walked through battlefields and through ruins. He had seen men fight with fire and steel, and he had seen them build with their bare hands. He had listened to the cries of children and the songs of workers. He knew now that his duty was not as simple as he had once believed. Humanity could not be judged by one face alone. They carried both ruin and hope together. When he stood before the queen, she asked him what truth he had found. Her eyes held no fear, only patience, as if she already knew the answer that weighed on him. He told her that humanity was unlike any people he had ever seen. He said their wars were terrible, their fury unmatched, and their wounds deeper than most could endure. He said he feared their return to war, for if such fury ever spread beyond their lands, no force could stop them. Yet he also said he had seen men and women rise from ashes, refusing to surrender, building again with unbroken hands. He told her that this strength was more frightening than their weapons, for it meant they would never truly fall. The queen listened in silence, her gaze steady. Then she told him that humanity would always carry the shadow of war. She said men were capable of destruction but also of creation, and the choice between them was never simple. Admitted they had made mistakes, that blood had stained their history. But she also said that in every grave lay the seed of tomorrow. She told him it was not his place to decide their path, only to witness what they chose. John entered the hall then, his steps slow, his face lined with weariness. He bowed to the queen and spoke of the men he had buried, of the duty that still weighed on him. He said he would keep fighting if needed, not for glory, but so that children could live without chains. Claire followed behind him, her hands wrapped in cloth from tending to the sick. She bowed as well and told the queen of the wounded she had saved, of the children who smiled even after loss. The observer looked at them both and saw in their faces the truth of humanity. They were scarred, they were weary, but they were unbroken. The queen turned back to the observer and asked again if he would judge them. He stood in silence, torn. At last he said he could not. He said humanity was both danger and hope, feared their strength in war, yet he also feared denying the light they carried in peace. He confessed that he was no longer a judge but a witness. He would carry what he had seen, but he could not place a final mark upon them. Humanity was too great and too dangerous to be bound by his words alone. For a long moment the hall was silent. Then the queen nodded slowly. She said that was enough. She told him that judgment was never meant to be simple, and that perhaps the greatest truth was to accept what could not be contained. She thanked him for his eyes, for he had seen them as they truly were. When the observer left the hall, the city stretched before him. Lights glowed in windows, voices carried in the night, and children ran through the streets with laughter. The scars of war were still there, but so was life. He looked at them one last time and felt fear rise again in his heart. Not fear of their ruin, but fear of their strength. He knew now that if humanity ever returned to war with all their will, nothing could stop them. And that truth would follow him forever.